I sat across from Elena Voss, watching her fingers rest on the contract like it already owned me. The cafe smelled like coffee and lies. I said, "Why are we meeting in public?" She didn't look up. She slid the folder toward me and said, "Because I don't want a scene." I laughed, sharp and bitter, and said, "You used to love my scenes." She replied, "People change." I asked, "Is that what this is?" She said, "Read it." I didn't touch the papers. I said, "Say it out loud." She exhaled slowly and said, "I'm offering you money to disappear." My stomach dropped. I whispered, "Disappear?" She nodded. I said, "From where?" She answered, "From my life, from the company, from everything." I leaned back and said, "You're joking." She finally looked at me and said, "I don't joke with members like that." I glanced at the amount and felt sick. I said, "This is a payoff." She said, "It's compensation." I asked, "For loving you?" She replied, "For being in the way." That cut deep. I said, "You promised we were building this together." She said, "We were. Then I outgrew you." I clenched my jaw and asked, "So I'm a problem now?" She said, "You're a liability." I stared at her and said, "When did I become something you erase?" She didn't answer. I said, "You already replaced me, didn't you?" Her silence was loud. I laughed again and said, "That's your answer." She said, "I need you gone before things get complicated." I asked, "For who?" She said, "For me." I leaned forward and said, "Do you feel anything right now?" She paused and said, "I feel resolved." I shook my head and said, "I loved you." She replied, "Love doesn't survive power." I whispered, "You sound proud." She said, "I am." I looked down at the contract and said, "You planned this." She nodded. I said, "How long?" She answered, "Long enough." My hands trembled. I said, "So this is blood money?" She said, "It's clean." I said, "It feels heavy." She said, "It will feel lighter once you're gone." I asked, "And if I say no?" She met my eyes and said, "Then things get ugly." I swallowed and said, "You're threatening me now?" She said, "I'm protecting myself." I laughed softly and said, "You always were good at that." I picked up the pen. I said, "Say you still care." She looked away and said, "Sign." The pen shook as I wrote my name. I slid the contract back and said, "You'll regret this." She stood up and said, "I already paid for it." I watched her walk away. I sat there alone, rich, erased, and already haunted. I changed my name the same night the money cleared. I told myself it was simple. I packed one bag and said, "You're free now." The city lights faded behind the bus window, and I said, "This is what you wanted." No one answered. I rented a small apartment under a name that felt fake in my mouth. I unlocked the door and said, "Home." The word sounded wrong. I checked my phone and deleted every contact. I said, "Clean break." My silence replied, "Coward." I opened the banking app and stared at the balance. I whispered, "You paid for this." The numbers stared back. I said, "Freedom shouldn't feel this heavy." At night, I talked to myself because there was no one else. I said, "You did the smart thing." I answered, "You did the easy thing." I tried sleeping, but Elena's voice followed me. I said, "Stop." My mind said, "You signed." I walked to the corner store and the cashier asked, "Name?" I hesitated and said the fake one. He smiled and said, "Nice to meet you." I almost laughed. I said, "You too," and felt invisible. Back upstairs, someone knocked. I opened the door and a man stood there holding a toolbox. He said, "You knew?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm Mark. If the heater acts up, knock." I said, "Thanks." He looked at me and said, "You okay?" I said, "I'm fine." He nodded like he didn't believe me but didn't care. Days passed quietly. I ate alone and said, "This is peace." My chest said, "This is punishment." I replayed Elena's last look and said, "She chose power." I answered, "She chose without you." One night I stared at the ceiling and said, "What if I went back?" I laughed and said, "You sold that right." I texted her number and erased it. I said, "She doesn't get you anymore." My heart said, "She already took you." I sat on the floor counting breaths and money. I said, "I survived." The room whispered, "You vanished." I realized then that disappearing didn't erase the pain. It taught the pain where to wait. I knocked on Mark's door one evening. I said, "Do you have sugar?" He said, "Sure." He handed it over and said, "You settling in?" I said, "Trying." He said, "City ghosts take time." I froze and said, "What?" He shrugged and said, "People come here to forget." I said, "Does it work?" He said, "Depends what is chasing you." I went back inside and said, "Nothing's chasing me." My reflection said, "You ran." I poured a drink and said, "To new beginnings." I drank alone. My phone buzzed with a random alert and my heart jumped. I said, "She won't call." Silence answered. I sat on the bed and said, "I bought my freedom." The walls said nothing. I realized money can buy distance, not peace. I lay down and said, "Tomorrow will be better." The darkness said, "Tomorrow remembers." I closed my eyes and saw her smile. I whispered, "I'm sorry." The apology had nowhere to land. I stared at the ceiling again and said, "You're safe." My chest answered with silence. I checked the door twice and said, "No one knows you." The room felt smaller. I sat up and said, "This is the deal." My voice cracked. I pressed my palms together and said, "You chose this." The money sat in my account like a witness. I said, "I'll learn to live with it." The night didn't argue. Somewhere far away, a city kept breathing without me, and I understood I wasn't gone. I was waiting. I said, "Waiting hurts." The quiet replied with time. I turned off the light and whispered, "I'll endure." The promise felt thin, but it stayed. For now, that was all I had, and it had to be enough. I breathed and waited. I was stirring my coffee when someone bumped into my table and said, "Sorry." I looked up and said, "It's fine." She didn't move away. She tilted her head and said, "You sure?" I said, "Positive." She smiled like she didn't believe me and said, "You have the face of someone who lies politely." That made my chest tighten. I said, "Do I know you?" She said, "Not yet." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without asking. I said, "You usually join strangers like this?" She replied, "Only when they look like they're hiding." I said, "I think you have the wrong person." She held out her hand and said, "Rhea Collins." I shook it and said my fake name. She repeated it slowly and said, "That doesn't fit you." I laughed and said, "Names don't have to." She studied my face and said, "They usually do." I asked, "What do you want?" She said, "Coffee." She waved at the barista and ordered without looking away from me. I said, "You're staring." She said, "You noticed." I said, "I don't like attention." She said, "Then you picked the wrong face." My pulse jumped. I said, "If this is a sales pitch," she interrupted and said, "Relax, I'm a journalist." I froze. She noticed and smiled. She said, "That reaction was interesting." I said, "People hate journalists." She said, "People who have secrets do." I leaned back and said, "You're fishing." She said, "I'm confirming." I asked, "Confirming what?" She said, "That you disappeared." I laughed too loud and said, "I just moved." She nodded and said, "That's what they all say." I asked, "They?" She sipped her coffee and said, "Men who vanish after signing contracts." My throat went dry. I said, "I think you should leave." She said, "You think that because I mentioned contracts." I stood up and said, "You're mistaken." She said, "Sit down." I said, "You don't get to tell me." She cut in and said, "Elena Voss does." My legs felt weak. I sat. I whispered, "You don't know what you're talking about." She said, "I know her company pays people to disappear quietly." I said, "That's insane." She said, "So is erasing lives." I asked, "Why tell me this?" She said, "Because I think you're one of them." I shook my head and said, "You're wrong." She leaned closer and said, "Then why are you shaking?" I clenched my hands and said, "You should go." She said, "I will." She stood and added, "But I'll be back." I said, "Don't." She smiled and said, "Too late." She walked out. I stayed frozen. My coffee went cold. I whispered, "She doesn't know you." My chest said, "She sees you." Later that week she appeared again. She said, "You didn't move." I said, "You're stalking me." She said, "I'm persistent." I asked, "What do you want?" She said, "The truth." I said, "You can't afford it." She said, "I can't afford silence." I said, "You'll get hurt." So did you. That landed hard. I said, "You don't know me." She said, "I know you were paid to vanish." I whispered, "Stop." She said, "Tell me I'm wrong." I couldn't. She softened and said, "I'm not here to expose you." I said, "Then why?" She said, "Because you matter." I laughed bitterly and said, "No one thinks that." She met my eyes and said, "I do." My heart pounded. I said, "You shouldn't." She said, "That's never stopped me." She stood and said, "I'll wait." I asked, "For what?" She said, "For you to remember who you are." She left again. I sat there shaking. I whispered, "She shouldn't know me." My reflection answered, "But she does." For the first time since I vanished, I felt seen, and that terrified me more than being erased. My phone buzzed once at midnight. One message, one sentence. "Things have changed." My hands shook as I read it. I said, "No." I locked the screen and said, "Not again." The phone buzzed again. I didn't open it. I whispered, "You don't get to come back." My chest tightened. I remembered her voice saying, "Trust me." I laughed softly and said, "That was the problem." I paced the room and said, "You paid me to disappear." The phone buzzed again. I opened it. She wrote, "Someone is asking questions." I typed, "Not my problem." She replied, "It became your problem when you left." I sat on the bed and said, "You wanted this." She wrote, "I didn't expect this." I stared at the screen and said, "You never expect consequences." My mind flashed back to nights we stayed up planning futures. I said, "We built everything together." I remembered telling her, "We're a team." I remembered her saying, "Always." I whispered, "Liar." She typed, "You were never supposed to matter this much." I laughed bitterly and typed, "That's the truth then." She replied, "I protected you." I typed, "You erased me." She paused. I imagined her jaw tightening the way it used to. She typed, "Power changes things." I said out loud, "Power changed you." I typed, "You chose it." She wrote, "I chose survival." I replied, "So did I." She sent, "They think you know something." My stomach dropped. I typed, "Who is they?" She didn't answer. I said, "Answer me." She wrote, "People who don't negotiate." I remembered her warning me once, saying, "If you ever leave, it won't be clean." I whispered, "So this is that." I typed, "You said disappearing would fix everything." She replied, "I was wrong." That felt heavier than an apology. I said, "You were always wrong." Another message came through. "Rhea Collins is getting close." My heart pounded. I typed, "Stay away from her." She wrote, "She's already too close." I said, "You dragged her into this." She replied, "You did when you mattered." I closed my eyes and said, "You didn't lose control. You lost me." The phone buzzed again. Rhea's name flashed. She said, "You look like someone haunted." I said, "Bad timing." She said, "That's when truth shows up." I asked, "Why are you here?" She said, "Because you're shaking." I said, "You shouldn't be involved." She said, "Too late." I said, "You don't know what you're touching." She said, "I know you're scared." I laughed and said, "I don't get scared." She said, "You're lying." I said, "Go home." She said, "Not until you stop pretending." I said, "Pretending keeps people alive." She said, "So does honesty." My phone buzzed again. Elena wrote, "Your silence is dangerous." I said to Rhea, "She's watching." Rhea said, "Good." I asked, "Why good?" She said, "Because it means you matter." I said, "That's not a compliment." She said, "It's leverage." I looked at my phone and said, "My absence broke her plans." Rhea said, "Your absence made you valuable." That truth settled slowly. I said, "I never wanted power." Rhea said, "Power wants you anyway." I stared at the screen and said, "She paid me to vanish." Rhea said, "And now they're fighting over you." I whispered, "I was never supposed to be this important." Rhea met my eyes and said, "That's why they're afraid." My phone buzzed again. I didn't answer. I looked at Rhea and said, "If I speak, people fall." She said, "If you stay silent, you disappear again." I closed my eyes and said, "I'm tired of being buried." The past pressed against me, alive and breathing. I finally understood. Leaving didn't end the story. It changed the value of my name. She didn't introduce herself at first. She sat across from me, crossed her legs, and said, "You've been hard to reach." I said, "That's the point." She smiled and said, "I admire intention." I said, "You shouldn't be here." She replied, "People like me are always where we shouldn't be." I asked, "Who are you?" She said, "Valeria Kane." The name landed heavy. I said, "You're a fixer." She nodded and said, "Political, corporate, personal." I leaned back and said, "Then fix your exit." She laughed and said, "Cute." I said, you don't scare me. She said, good. Fear clouds judgment. I asked, what do you want? She said, you. I scoffed and said, get in line. She smiled wider and said, I already skipped it. She placed a thin folder on the table and said, you vanished for 7 figures. I felt my spine tighten. I said, you don't know that. She opened the folder and slid a copy of the contract toward me. She said, Elena Voss made a sloppy move. I said, you shouldn't have this. She said, you shouldn't exist. I clenched my jaw and said, say your point. She leaned in and said, I can protect you. I laughed and said, from who? She replied, from the people Elena annoyed by paying you. I said, I didn't ask for protection. She said, you didn't ask to matter either. I said, I want to be left alone. She said, that option expired. I pushed the contract back and said, I'm not a pawn. She said, everyone is. I said, not anymore. She studied me and said, you really think disappearing made you small? I said, it made me free. She shook her head and said, it made you valuable. I said, to who? She said, to anyone who understands leverage. I asked, what's your price? She said, loyalty. I laughed and said, that's expensive. She said, so are you. I said, I won't work for you. She said, I don't hire. I said, then leave. She said, I partner. I stood up and said, we're done. She stayed seated and said, sit. I sat. She said, you're being hunted quietly. I said, by who? She said, people who don't like loose ends. I said, Elena created this. She said, Elena lost control. I said, good. She said, careful. Chaos doesn't care who deserves it. I rubbed my face and said, why me? She said, because you saw things. I said, I saw nothing. She said, you were in rooms before doors closed. I said, I signed an exit. She said, you signed a mistake. I asked, and you want to use me to fix it? She said, I want to aim you. I said, I won't be owned again. She nodded slowly and said, that's why I want you. I said, you're no better than her. She said, I never pretend to be. I looked away and said, 3 women now want a piece of me. She said, one wants you silent. One wants you exposed. I want you alive. I asked, at what cost? She said, control. I shook my head and said, I won't choose another cage. She stood and said, then choose timing. She slid a card toward me and said, when it gets loud, call me. I said, and if I don't? She smiled and said, then you'll learn how weak silence is. She walked away. I sat there breathing hard. I said to myself, you're not weak. The truth settled in. I never was. I was underestimated. I stared at my phone and said, I'm done reacting. The screen showed Elena's name again. I turned it face down and said, you don't get another answer. My chest felt tight, but steady. I knocked on Ria's door before I could change my mind. She opened it and said, you look decided. I said, I'm tired of lying. She stepped aside and said, then come in. I sat and said, you were right. She said, about what? I said, I was paid to vanish. She didn't smile. She said, how much? I said, enough to disappear forever. She said, and yet you're here. I nodded and said, because it didn't work. She leaned forward and said, who paid you? I hesitated and said, Elena. Ria exhaled and said, I knew it. I said, I won't give you everything. She said, I'm not asking for everything. I said, I won't be your story. She said, I won't write you without consent. That mattered, I said. People are watching me. She said, then stop hiding. I laughed and said, that's easy to say. She replied, so was disappearing. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered and said, I said no. Valeria's voice came through and said, I didn't ask again. I said, I'm not working for you. She said, you're already involved. I said, not by choice. She said, choice is a luxury. I said, then consider this one. I hung up, my hand shook. Ria said, you okay? I said, no, but I'm clear. I left and walked upstairs. Mark was sitting on the steps. He said, you look like you're about to run. I sat beside him and said, I was good at that. He said, people who run usually come back tired. I said, what if they stop running? He shrugged and said, then they start standing. I laughed quietly and said, I don't know who I am anymore. He said, you're the guy who shows up. I said, I vanished once. He said, you're here now. I looked at my hands and said, I don't want revenge. He said, good. I asked, why good? He said, revenge keeps you tied. I said, and forgiveness? He said, that's harder. I stood up and said, I'm not forgiving. He said, then don't. I paused and said, I'm not disappearing again. He nodded and said, that's a start. I went inside and opened my laptop. I searched my real name, old articles, old work. Pieces of me still online. I said, I'm still here. I closed the laptop when my phone buzzed again. Elena. I didn't open it. I said out loud, you don't own me. I deleted the message unread. My breathing slowed. I called Ria and said, I'm choosing silence on my terms. She said, that's control. I said, for the first time. She said, I won't move without you. I said, thank you. I sat on the bed and said, I wasn't weak. The words felt solid. I said, I was scared. That felt honest. I opened the banking app and said, you don't decide my worth. I didn't move the money. I didn't touch it. I let it sit. I stood at the mirror and said, you're not for sale. My reflection didn't argue. Outside, the city hummed. I breathed and said, I'm staying. It felt like stepping into myself again, not loud, not brave. Just real, and for the first time since I vanished, I wasn't running. I said nothing, and things started breaking anyway. Ria sat across from me and said, she's losing ground. I asked, how bad? She said, bad enough to make calls she swore she never would. I leaned back and said, I'm not doing anything. Ria nodded and said, that's the point. She slid her laptop toward me and said, look. I scanned headlines and said, leaks? She said, patterns. I said, you didn't use my name. She said, I don't need to. My phone buzzed. Elena. I didn't answer. Ria watched me and said, you're calm. I said, I'm tired. She said, power hates silence. I said, good. The phone buzzed again. I turned it off. I said, she wanted me gone. Ria said, now she wants you quiet. I laughed once and said, that's worse. Ria closed the laptop and said, people are asking where the missing money went. I said, I know. She said, she's bleeding allies. I said, I'm not celebrating. She said, you don't have to. We sat there listening to the room breathe. Another number called. I answered and said, make it fast. Valeria's voice said, you're enjoying this. I said, I'm watching. She said, Elena is spiraling. I said, not my problem. She said, it becomes your problem when she points at you. I said, she already did. Valeria paused and said, you're calm. I said, you keep saying that. She said, calm men are dangerous. I said, I'm not dangerous. She said, you're unpredictable. I said, so are consequences. She sighed and said, she's leaking your existence. I said, I haven't spoken. She said, silence speaks. I said, you offered control. She said, you refused it. I said, and yet here we are. She said, you can't stay invisible forever. I said, I'm not hiding. She said, you're contained. I said, by who? She said, by patience. I ended the call. Ria said, she threatening you? I said, she's nervous. Ria smiled slightly and said, good. I asked, why good? She said, because fear exposes cracks. I checked my email, anonymous tips, messages asking questions. I said, it's spreading. Ria said, and you're not chasing it. I said, I won't. She said, that's control. I stood and walked to the window. I said, I don't feel powerful. Ria said, you don't need to. My phone buzzed again. Elena. I let it ring. Ria said, you're letting her unravel. I said, she chose this. Ria said, you were never supposed to walk away clean. I said, I didn't. She said, you walked away alive. I said, barely. Ria said, that's still a win. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered and said, stop. A strained voice said, we need to talk. I said, you should have done that earlier. Silence. I hung up. Ria said, you okay? I said, I feel like a storm watching from shore. She said, storms don't beg. I said, I used to. She said, not anymore. Later, Mark knocked and said, you've got tension leaking under the door. I said, it's temporary. He said, all power is. I said, people are fighting over me. He said, then stand still. I said, that feels wrong. He said, running would feel familiar. I sat and said, they're trying to contain me. Mark said, you can't cage someone who won't move. Night fell quietly. Messages stacked unanswered. I didn't reply. I didn't explain. I didn't disappear. Somewhere, Elena was losing rooms she once controlled. Somewhere Valeria was recalculating. And I sat in silence, realizing something had shifted. I wasn't asking to exist anymore. They were trying to decide what to do with me. She stood across from me under the awning and said, we need to talk. I said, you said that with money. She flinched and said, I'm sorry. I waited. She said, I was afraid. I said, that wasn't an apology. She said, it's the truth. I said, truth doesn't erase contracts. She stepped closer and said, I didn't think you'd survive disappearing. I said, you didn't care. She shook her head and said, I cared too much. I laughed once and said, you paid me to vanish. She said, I paid fear. I said, same thing. She swallowed and said, I lost control. I said, you gave it away. She said, power makes enemies. I said, power made you lonely. She looked tired. She said, come back. I said, no. She said, we can fix this. I said, you already fixed me out. She said, I'll protect you. I said, from you? She winced. She said, from them. I said, I'm done being hidden. She said, they'll crush you. I said, they already tried. She reached for my arm and said, please. I stepped back and said, don't. She said, I didn't know another way. I said, you chose the cruel one. She said, I chose survival. I said, so did I. She said, I miss us. I said, you miss control. She said, that's not fair. I said, neither was the price. She exhaled and said, I was scared you'd leave. I said, you pushed me. She said, I never thought you'd become leverage. I said, I never thought you'd sell me. She closed her eyes and said, I'm sorry. I believed her and it didn't matter. I said, I forgive you. She looked up hopeful. I said, and I'm still leaving. Her face fell. She said, without anger? I said, without chains. She said, you're making a mistake. I said, I'm making a choice. She said, you'll regret it. I said, I already did. She stood smaller than before and said, I don't know how to stop this. I said, you don't. She whispered, then what am I supposed to do? I said, live with it. She said, I built everything for us. I said, you built it without me. She nodded and said, I broke us. I said, yes. Silence sat between us. She said, if you walk away, I lose. I said, you lost when you paid. She said, I never meant to hurt you. I said, meaning isn't mercy. She looked at the ground and said, I'm afraid. I said, so am I. She looked up and said, stay. I said, goodbye. I turned and walked. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. I felt light. Behind me, she said my name once. I didn't answer. That silence was the last thing I owed her, and it hurt her more than anything I could have said. I kept walking and said, I won't look back. The street answered with rain. I said, I don't hate you. My voice stayed steady. I said, I just won't return. My phone vibrated. I ignored it. I said, this ends here. Each step felt deliberate. I remembered nights, she said. We're unstoppable. I answered the memory. We were. I breathed and said, I choose quiet. The city moved around me. I said, I choose myself. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Somewhere behind me, power searched for a grip and found none. I kept moving, lighter, unowned, and finally free. I said, no more bargains. My chest eased. I said, no more cages. The night listened. I said, I'm done. The air felt open. I walked until her name lost weight, and my steps carried only me. I didn't run. I didn't chase. I simply continued forward, knowing the pain would fade, and the choice would remain mine alone, without regret or permission from anyone else ever. Ria called me before sunrise and said, it's live. I said, are you sure? She said, I double-checked everything. I asked, your name? She said, on it. I exhaled and said, they'll come for you. She said, they already have. I open my laptop and read the article slowly. No names where they shouldn't be. Patterns where they mattered. I said, "You were careful," she said. "I was honest." My phone buzzed nonstop. Unknown numbers. Blocked IDs, I said. It started. Ria said, "I know." I asked, "Are you scared?" She paused and said, "Yes." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be." I said, "This will cost you." She said, "Truth always does." I heard shouting in the background and said, "Where are you?" She said, "Office." I said, "Leave." She said, "I can't." I said, "They'll threaten you," she said. "They already did." I closed my eyes and said, "Valeria?" She said, indirectly. I said, "She doesn't like losing." Ria said, "Neither do I." I hung up and said, "Think." I checked my messages. Elena's name flashed once. I ignored it. Valeria's assistant left a voicemail saying, "You're crossing lines." I deleted it. I called Mark and said, "I need a favor." He said, "Name it." I said, "Can you make something disappear?" He laughed and said, "Depends what." I said, "A trail." He said, "Send it." I forwarded documents quietly, anonymously. I said, "No one knows this is me." Mark said, "They will suspect." I said, "Let them." I encrypted emails and sent tips to people who hated Valeria. I said to myself, quiet loyalty. My phone buzzed again. Ria said, "My editor is panicking." I said, "Stand your ground." She said, "They're threatening lawsuits." I said, "I'll handle it." She said, "How?" I said, "By being louder without speaking." She said, "That doesn't make sense." I said, "It will." I sent one message to the right person. No signature. No return. I said, "That's done." Ria whispered, "What did you do?" I said, "I evened the field." She said, "You're risking yourself." I said, "Not this time." She said, "Why help me?" I said, "Because you didn't sell me." Silence followed. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Be careful," she said. "You too." News alerts stacked fast. Shares, reposts, quiet confirmations from insiders. I said, "They can't stop it." My phone rang. Valeria's voice cut through and said, "You chose sides." I said, "I chose people," she said. "This ends badly." I said, "It already did." She said, "You think this makes you safe?" I said, "No." She said, "Then why do it?" I said, "Because it's right." She laughed coldly and said, "Right doesn't survive." I said, "It does in people." I ended the call. I sat on the bed and felt my hands shaking. Not fear, relief. I said, "I didn't hide." I checked on Ria again. She said, "I might lose my job." I said, "You won't lose yourself." She laughed softly and said, "You sound sure." I said, "For once I am." Outside, sirens passed. My phone stayed quiet for a moment. I said, "This is what it costs." The price felt fair. I leaned back and said, "I chose loyalty." My chest felt open. I said, "I feel human." The word stayed. I didn't regret it. Even if everything burned tomorrow, today I stood with someone, not behind money, not behind fear. And that felt like winning. The news alert didn't feel loud. It felt heavy. I read the headline and said, "So it's over." Ria called and said, "Valeria's name is out." I asked, "Fully?" She said, "Enough." I said, "She deny it." Ria replied, "She already tried." I leaned back and said, "And?" Ria said, "And it didn't work." I closed my eyes and said, "Good." There was no joy in it. "Just air," Ria added. "Elena resigned this morning." I asked, "Public?" She said, "Quiet." I nodded and said, "That fits." Ria said, "She didn't fight." I said, "She knows when to retreat." Silence stretched. Ria asked, "How do you feel?" I searched for the answer and said, "Still." She said, "That's not nothing." I hung up and sat alone. My phone buzzed once. Valeria. I didn't answer. It buzzed again. I turned it off. I said out loud, "You don't get my voice." Mark knocked and said, "You see the news?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Big names falling." I said, quietly. He said, "Those are the worst falls." I asked, "You ever feel bad for them?" He shrugged and said, "They chose height." I nodded and said, "I didn't push." He said, "You didn't need to." I checked my messages. Lawyers, journalists, empty threats. I said, No explosions. Mark said. Explosions distract. I said, this feels heavier, he said. That's consequence. My phone buzzed again, Elena this time. One message. I stepped down, I stared at it and said, I know. I didn't reply. Another message came. I hope you're safe, I whispered, you never knew how. I deleted it. The room felt calm. Too calm. I said, is this justice? Mark said, what do you think? I said, it doesn't hurt like I thought. He said, pain isn't the only measure. I said, no one screamed. He said, that's how power ends. I walked to the window and watched people move like nothing happened. I said, the world didn't stop. Mark said, it never does. Ria called again and said, they're circling you now. I said, let them. She said, you're not hiding. I said, I'm not attacking. She said, you're letting gravity work. I smiled slightly and said, that's new. She said, I might keep my job. I said, you earned it. She said, you helped. I said, I stayed. She laughed and said, that mattered. The call ended. I sat and breathed. Valeria's voicemail appeared, then disappeared. I said, she's scrambling. Mark said, people do when the floor drops. I said, I don't feel victorious. He said, good. I asked, why? He said, victory wants witnesses. I said, I don't want any. Night settled quietly. No sirens. No shouting. Just updates and resignations. I said, this is karma? Mark said, slow. Heavy. I nodded and said, it fits. My phone stayed silent. I realized no one needed me anymore. That surprised me. I said, I'm free. Mark said, you were free when you stopped chasing. I thought of Elena sitting in an empty office. I felt no anger. I thought of Valeria calculating exits. I felt no joy. I said, cruelty would have felt easier. Mark said, justice rarely does. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said, I didn't destroy anyone. Mark said, you didn't have to. I said, they did it themselves. He said, exactly. Sleep came without resistance. Before it took me, I said, I don't need revenge. The words stayed true. I understood then that justice doesn't shout. It waits, it watches, it lets people face what they built. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't ask permission. It just settles quietly like this night, leaving nothing to chase and no reason to run ever again. I sat at the small kitchen table and said, so this is what's left. Mark leaned against the counter and said, looks like peace. I said, it feels quieter. He said, quiet scares people. I said, it doesn't scare me anymore. He nodded and said, that's growth. I stared at the envelope with the bank details and said, I thought this money was everything. Mark said, what is it now? I said, just numbers. He smiled and said, good answer. Ria called and said, you disappeared from the noise. I said, I stayed. She laughed softly and said, that's new for you. I said, I didn't lose myself. She said, you sound steady. I said, I feel real. She paused and said, I'm proud of you. I said, that means more than headlines. She said, you kept your voice. I said, I almost sold it. She replied, but you didn't. We hung up. I looked around the room and said, I don't need much. Mark said, most people don't. I said, I lost cities. He said, you gained ground. I said, I lost a future I imagined. He said, you found one you chose. I opened the window and said, I can breathe here. Mark said, then stay. I said, I will. My phone buzzed once. Unknown number. I didn't answer. I said, not everything deserves access. Mark said, boundaries look good on you. I laughed quietly and said, I used to chase approval. He said, and now? I said, now I choose purpose. He asked, what purpose? I said, to live honest. He nodded and said, that's enough. I checked the bank app and said, I'm keeping some of it. Mark raised an eyebrow. I said, not as a shield. He said, as a tool? I said, as an option. He smiled and said, that's healthy. Ria texted and said, dinner sometime? I replied, yes. I paused and added, no secrets. She sent back, deal. I leaned back and said, I didn't vanish. Mark said, you shed weight. I said, I kept my dignity. He said, hardest thing to hold. I said, I kept my name. He said, even if you don't use it. I said, I kept my choice. Silence filled the room without pressure. I said, I don't hate them. Mark said, you don't need to. I said, I don't forgive them either. He said, that's allowed. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen and said, I know who I am. Mark said, say it. I said, I'm not for sale. The words felt settled. I said, I'm not missing. He said, you're here. I stood up and said, tomorrow I'll work. Mark asked, on what? I said, something small. He smiled and said, small lasts. I turned off the light and said, I didn't keep the power. Mark said, power never stays. I said, I kept myself. The room felt right. I lay down and said, this is enough. No one argued. Outside, life moved on without spectacle. I didn't need it to notice me. I had noticed myself. That was what remained. I woke up before the alarm and said, I'm still here. The room didn't argue. I sat on the edge of the bed and said, no one's chasing me. My phone stayed quiet. I smiled and said, that's new. I made coffee and said, this is enough. Mark passed by and said, you're up early. I said, I slept well. He nodded and said, that's how you know it's over. I asked, over? He said, the running. I laughed softly and said, yeah. Ria texted and said, morning. I replied, morning. She sent, still standing? I typed, stronger. She replied, good. I put the phone down and said, I don't need to explain myself anymore. Mark said, you earned that. I looked at the door and said, I remember when I thought disappearing would save me. Mark said, it saved you from noise. I said, but not from myself. He said, nothing does. I finished my coffee and said, I learned my value when they tried to erase it. Mark said, funny how that works. I said, staying proved it. He said, staying always does. I stepped outside and said, I don't feel hunted. The street felt ordinary. I said, I don't feel owned. The air felt clean. I said, I don't feel erased. My voice didn't shake. I walked without checking behind me. I said, that's freedom. I passed the cafe where everything once cracked and said, I survived you. No ghosts answered. My phone buzzed once. Unknown number. I deleted it without reading. I said, not today. Ria called and said, any regrets? I thought and said, no. She said, not even a little? I said, disappearing taught me my worth. She paused. I added, staying proved it. She smiled through the line and said, that's a good ending. I said, it's a beginning. She said, dinner tonight? I said, yes. She said, just us. I said, that's perfect. The call ended. I kept walking and said, I don't need power. A memory answered, you never did. I said, I don't need revenge. The silence agreed. I said, I don't need permission. My steps stayed steady. I passed a window and caught my reflection. I said, you look lighter. The reflection stayed. I said, you were never for sale. The words felt final. I thought of Elena without bitterness. I thought of Valeria without fear. I said, they don't define me. I sat on a bench and watched people rush by. I said, I'm not late. Time felt kind. I checked the bank app and said, this doesn't own me. I closed it. I said, I choose how I live. A breeze moved past me. I said, I choose who I trust. My phone stayed quiet. I said, I choose myself. That felt enough. I stood and walked home, not hiding, not proving, not explaining. I said, I stayed. The city kept moving. I moved with it, not as a ghost, not as leverage, just as a man who learned his worth the hard way and kept it. That was the truth. That was the end. And it was mine.